The office was nearly deserted, the usual buzz of voices and phones reduced to silence, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. I glanced around, the empty cubicles dimly lit by the glow of computer monitors still running late into the night. My desk was piled with reports and spreadsheets, the end-of-quarter tasks that couldn't wait. I was exhausted, but strangely at peace in the quiet. There was a comfort in working without distractions, in letting the hours slip by unnoticed. My focus was so deep that I didn't notice the sound of approaching footsteps until they stopped at the doorway. I looked up, blinking as I adjusted to the figure standing there, and felt a jolt of surprise. It was Nathaniel, my boss. He rarely stayed late, and even more rarely did he make his way to this side of the building. His presence was unexpected and oddly grounding, breaking the stillness of the evening with a steady intensity. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, his voice low, a soft undercurrent of amusement in his tone. He stepped into the office, his gaze sweeping over the stacks of paper on my desk. I managed a small smile, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. "Seems like I'm the last one here," I replied. "There's just so much to get through, and I figured I'd have more luck without the usual interruptions." He nodded, his eyes lingering on me a second longer than expected, creating a subtle tension in the air. "I know the feeling," he said, moving around to the other side of my desk. I ended up staying late myself, catching up on a few things. His gaze softened slightly, his tone shifting to something more personal. "It's rare to find anyone else here at this hour." He leaned against the edge of my desk, and I noticed the faintest glimmer of a smile as he looked at the piles of work in front of me. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, and he looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, as though the lateness of the hour had stripped away some of the usual formality. There was something unexpectedly reassuring in the way he held himself. His usual sharpness softened, creating an atmosphere that felt somehow intimate. "Let me guess," he said, glancing at the spreadsheet on my screen. "Quarterly reports." I nodded, chuckling. "The one thing that refuses to be put off." He shook his head, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I have to admire your dedication," he murmured, his gaze thoughtful. "Most people would have bolted hours ago." "Well," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm, "someone's got to keep the wheels turning." He laughed softly, the sound low and rich, and the hint of warmth in his eyes sent a flicker of something unexpected through me. Nathaniel was usually reserved, professional to the point of seeming detached, yet here he was, leaning casually against my desk, the typical formality between US replaced by something far more relaxed and disarmingly real. The distance I'd felt from him as my boss felt softened now, replaced by a curiosity, a quiet intrigue. A silence settled between us, comfortable but charged, and I felt my pulse quicken, aware of how close he was. His gaze drifted from my screen back to me, and I felt his attention with a kind of intensity that was hard to ignore, even in such a casual setting. He glanced down at the papers scattered across my desk, then back up at me, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful, "I don't think I've seen anyone work as hard as you do." I laughed lightly, trying to deflect the unexpected praise. "It's just part of the job." "It's more than that," he replied, his gaze intent, unwavering. "It's rare." His words hung in the air, and I found myself momentarily at a loss for how to respond. There was a weight to his gaze, an appreciation that felt far more personal than anything I'd expected, and I felt a subtle thrill beneath the surface of my professional poise. It was as though he was seeing me not just as his employee, but as a person with strengths, with dedication that went beyond mere obligation. I felt a blush rise, warmth spreading through me as I met his gaze, our eyes locked in a way that felt unguarded, exposed. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a boundary, a line between boss and employee that neither of us had intended to approach, and yet here we were, neither willing to pull back. Nathaniel cleared his throat, glancing away, and the spell broke, leaving me feeling suddenly self-conscious. He reached for one of the reports on my desk, his fingers brushing mine in the process, a brief, barely there touch that nonetheless sent a shiver up my spine. He didn't pull his hand away immediately, his fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary, and I felt the air between us shift, the tension building with each passing second. When he finally withdrew, I felt the absence of his touch acutely, as though a warmth had been pulled away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He flipped through the report, his focus momentarily on the pages, though I sensed he was as aware of the charged silence between us as I was. "This is impressive work," he said quietly, finally breaking the silence. "You've done a lot here." The words were simple, but the look he gave me was anything but. There was an intensity in his gaze that made my pulse quicken, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred between us. It was as though he'd seen something in me, something beyond the employee he saw day after day, and the realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "Thank you," I managed, my voice softer than I intended. "It means a lot to hear that from you." His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable, as if something within him had cracked open. "You deserve it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "More than you know." The words hung in the air, and I felt an intense pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw us together despite the clear boundaries that should have kept us apart. He reached out as though to touch my hand again, but hesitated, his fingers hovering just above mine, suspended in that charged space between decision and restraint. The tension was nearly unbearable, a quiet storm brewing between us that felt both inevitable and impossible. Without another word, he withdrew, standing up straight and glancing away, the moment slipping back into the familiar shadows of professionalism. He cleared his throat, the warmth in his gaze replaced by a more neutral expression, though I sensed the struggle in him, the same internal battle I was fighting. "I should let you get back to work," he said, his voice steadier now, though the depth of his gaze betrayed him. "I didn't mean to keep you." I nodded, feeling the ache of the moment's loss, though I forced myself to smile. "Thank you again for stopping by." He lingered for a moment, as though he wanted to say something more, but he held back, his gaze locked on mine with a quiet intensity that lingered even after he turned to leave. As he walked out of the office, I let out a shaky breath, my heart racing, every nerve in my body alive with the memory of his touch, his words, the unspoken promises that had hung between us in that quiet, secluded space. The evening resumed its silence, the hum of the air conditioning filling the room once more, but nothing felt the same. The boundaries I had always respected, the professionalism that had kept us apart, it all felt fragile now, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. And I couldn't ignore the question lingering in my mind: what would happen if one of us reached out, crossed that line, allowed ourselves to feel what we both knew was there? The quiet that followed felt heavy, as though the very air held the weight of what had just happened, or almost happened. My pulse was still racing, my thoughts swirling as I replayed Nathaniel's gaze, the subtle brush of his hand, and the intensity of his words. It had been such a small moment, so easily passed off as nothing more than an oversight, a second too long between professional acquaintances, but it felt like so much more, like the first steps down a path I hadn't even realized was there. I turned back to my screen, but the spreadsheet's numbers blurred. Concentration felt impossible, my mind fixed on the last 20 minutes, on the quiet tension that had passed between us. Every part of me was still heightened, acutely aware of the charged energy that had filled the room. I pushed my chair back, rubbing my temples, and took a deep breath, trying to regain control. Yet, as hard as I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence, the look in his eyes. It was late, and I knew staying here wasn't going to bring any clarity. I decided to wrap up for the night, gathering my things with hands that still felt a little unsteady. I made my way down the hallway toward the exit, the quiet around me only amplifying the thoughts circling in my mind. As I reached the lobby, the echo of familiar footsteps drew my attention. Nathaniel was still here, standing near the entrance, apparently caught up in a call. He turned as I approached, and I watched the moment he noticed me, his expression shifting, softening as he gave me a small, almost reluctant smile. "Long night?" he asked as he ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Seems like it," I replied, feeling the warmth rise in my cheeks. "I wasn't expecting to still see you here." He nodded, his gaze holding mine in a way that felt grounding, solid. I could say the same. Not many people are as dedicated as you. There was a pause, an unspoken question hanging between us, and I sensed a hesitation in him, a restraint he was struggling to keep, but instead of moving on, he gestured toward the door. Would you care to join me for a coffee? Just a break from the paperwork. He added quickly, a small, almost self-conscious smile tugging at his lips. My heart leapt, a mixture of excitement and nervousness swirling inside me. There was nothing particularly strange about grabbing coffee with a colleague, nothing inappropriate, technically. Yet the invitation held a weight that made me feel like I was stepping into something unknown, something that went beyond casual. Sure, I replied softly, meeting his gaze. I could use a break. He smiled, and I felt the warmth of it spread through me, his usual reserved expression softening in a way that left me feeling both exhilarated and nervous. We left the office together, and I followed him down the street to a small, quiet cafe tucked away on a side street, its lights casting a soft glow over the empty tables. Inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint hum of jazz music, a soothing atmosphere that seemed to melt away the rest of the world. Nathaniel ordered for both of us, and we settled by the window, the city's lights casting a gentle illumination over his features. For a moment we sat in silence, sipping our coffee, as though letting the quiet fill the space between us. It's strange, isn't it? He said after a while, his voice soft, reflective, spending so much time working together but never really talking. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Yes, it is. You can spend years working side by side with someone and still feel like strangers. He looked at me, his gaze thoughtful, intense, and yet, sometimes even the smallest moments make you feel like you know someone, or at least want to. His words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we both felt but hadn't spoken of. I could feel the quiet pull between us, an unspoken understanding that we were both standing on the edge of something new, something fragile and thrilling. Tell me about yourself, he said, his voice softer now, as though afraid to break the quiet intimacy that had settled around us. It was a simple request, yet it felt loaded, as though he were asking for something deeper, something real. I found myself sharing more than I usually would, telling him about my dreams, my fears, the small details of my life that I rarely shared. And he listened, truly listened, his gaze never wavering, his attention a steady presence that made me feel seen, understood. In turn, he opened up as well, revealing a side of himself that I hadn't seen before. There was a vulnerability in his words, a depth that hinted at the person beneath the professional facade. I could feel myself drawn to him, pulled in by the quiet strength, the warmth that softened his usual stoicism. Hours passed, and we were both surprised when we glanced at the time, realizing how late it had become. The city had quieted, the streets empty, the world reduced to just the two of us sitting across from each other, caught up in a moment that felt far removed from the constraints of our daily lives. He stood up, reaching for his coat, and I felt a pang of regret as the evening seemed to draw to a close. But as he helped me into my own coat, his fingers brushed my shoulder, lingering for just a moment, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine. His gaze met mine, filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "For tonight." I managed to smile, though my heart was racing. "Thank you. I didn't realize how much I needed this." He took a step closer, his gaze holding mine, and I felt the weight of everything unsaid, the quiet pull that had been building between us all evening. His hand moved toward mine, hesitating just inches away, and I sensed the struggle in him, the tension between restraint and the desire to reach out. Finally, he withdrew, stepping back, his expression shifting to something more guarded, though I could see the conflict in his eyes. "I should let you get home," he said, his voice quiet, his tone more formal now, as though trying to reclaim the distance that had existed between us before. But I felt the ache of the moment slipping away, a longing for something I couldn't quite name, something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I nodded, offering him a small smile, though I knew he could sense the disappointment in my eyes. As we stepped outside, the cool night air felt sharp against my skin, bringing me back to reality. We walked together in silence, our footsteps echoing in the quiet streets, each step a reminder of the boundary we'd nearly crossed, the connection we'd both felt but hadn't dared to name. When we reached the corner where our paths would diverge, he stopped, turning to face me. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, the silence between us filled with everything we weren't saying. I felt the pull again, the urge to reach out, to close the distance between us, but I held back, uncertain, afraid of what might happen if we allowed ourselves to give in. "Good night," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer than necessary. "Good night," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him turn and walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. As I made my way home, I replayed the evening over and over in my mind, the warmth of his gaze, the quiet intensity of his touch, the sense of connection that had left me feeling both exhilarated and vulnerable. The memory of his words, his closeness lingered with me, a reminder of everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't allowed ourselves to feel. And as I reached my apartment, I knew that something between us had shifted irrevocably, that the line we'd both respected for so long had blurred, leaving us standing on the edge of something new, something both thrilling and uncertain. The days that followed were a blur of routine, but beneath it all, the memory of that night simmered, a quiet, unspoken presence that lingered in every glance, every exchange. I tried to throw myself into work, focusing on my tasks, but it was impossible to ignore the subtle changes, the tension that seemed to hover whenever Nathaniel was nearby. His presence felt heightened, charged, as though the energy between us was ready to ignite at any moment. We continued to interact as usual, our exchanges professional, careful, but every once in a while our eyes would meet, and I'd catch that same quiet intensity in his gaze. It was as though he was seeing me differently, as though something had shifted between us, something neither of us could quite name. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed him lingering near his office, the glow of his desk lamp casting a warm light over his face. He looked up as I passed, his gaze holding mine, and I felt my steps falter, a quiet anticipation building between us. "Heading out?" he asked, his voice soft, a hint of something unspoken beneath the words. I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken. "Yes, I just finished up." He glanced toward the elevator, his expression thoughtful, and I sensed his hesitation as though he was weighing something in his mind. After a moment he straightened, his hand resting on the edge of his desk as he looked at me, his gaze steady, intent. "Would you mind helping me with something?" he asked, his tone almost tentative. "Of course," I replied, surprised by the vulnerability in his request. He gestured toward his desk, indicating the pile of documents spread across it. "I was going over these figures, but I feel like I'm missing something. It's probably nothing, but another pair of eyes might help." I moved closer, leaning over the desk to look at the documents. The numbers were a tangle of quarterly data, projections and expenses, and as I scanned them, I felt him move beside me, his presence so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Our shoulders brushed as we worked side by side, and I felt a shiver run through me, my heart pounding as I sensed his gaze lingering on me. Every subtle touch, every accidental brush of his hand against mine, sent a thrill through me, the tension between us building with each passing moment. We worked in silence, but the air was thick with unspoken words, with a pull that felt impossible to ignore. After a while he leaned back, his expression softening, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "You're good at this," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. I felt my cheeks warm, flustered by the compliment. "I've had a good mentor," I replied, glancing up at him, my gaze lingering on the softness in his eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering just above mine, as though he wanted to touch me but was afraid to cross that line. I watched his fingers hesitate, his expression conflicted, and I felt a pang of sympathy, understanding the battle raging within him because it was one I was fighting too. Finally, he let out a sigh, his hand dropping to his side as he took a step back, his gaze filled with a quiet resolve. "I don't want to complicate things," he said softly, though his tone was thick with regret. "You deserve better than that." His words were both a comfort and a disappointment, and I felt my heart ache as I nodded, forcing a smile. I understand. But as we stood there, the silence between us stretching, I realized that understanding didn't make it any easier, that it didn't change the way I felt, the way his presence seemed to fill a part of me I hadn't even realized was empty. He reached out again, his hand brushing my shoulder, a gesture so brief, so fleeting, and yet it felt like a promise, a silent acknowledgement of everything we weren't saying, everything we weren't allowing ourselves to feel. "Good night," he murmured, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment longer before he turned to leave, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the empty office. As I made my way home that night, I felt a mix of emotions: regret, longing, and a quiet, lingering warmth. The connection between us was undeniable, a bond that felt as inevitable as it was complicated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both caught in something bigger than ourselves, something neither of us could fully understand. The weeks passed, and though we tried to maintain the distance, the tension between us only grew. Every glance, every accidental touch felt charged, a reminder of the night we had shared, of the quiet connection that had changed everything between us. One Friday evening, I found myself working late again, the office empty except for the soft glow of my desk lamp. I was lost in my work, the familiar hum of the building a comforting backdrop, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. I looked up, surprised to see Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of me sitting alone in the quiet office. "Late night again?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, offering a small smile. "Seems to be a habit." He chuckled softly, his gaze softening as he stepped into the room. "Mind if I join you?" I shook my head, feeling a thrill at the thought of his company. He moved to the chair beside me, settling in with a sigh as he glanced at the papers on my desk. For a while we worked in comfortable silence, the quiet between us filled with the soft rustle of pages and the occasional murmur as we shared insights, our conversation flowing naturally, effortlessly. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere shifted, the silence becoming something heavier, more charged. Finally, he set his papers aside, his gaze resting on me, and I felt my breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. He leaned forward, his hand reaching for mine, his touch gentle but insistent, a quiet question that I could feel resonating in every nerve. "I can't keep pretending this isn't real," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried, but I can't ignore what I feel." My heart was racing, every part of me alive with the weight of his words, with the thrill of knowing that he felt the same pull, the same impossible connection that had been building between us for weeks. "I can't either," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my hand tightening around his. He moved closer, his gaze never leaving mine, and I felt the air between us shift, the boundaries we had tried so hard to maintain finally dissolving. His hand slid up to cup my face, his thumb brushing softly against my cheek, and I leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth, the quiet strength that had drawn me to him in the first place. Our breaths mingled, shallow, and I felt the intensity of his gaze, the quiet hunger in his eyes as he leaned in, his lips barely grazing mine in a touch so soft it was almost a whisper. The world faded around us, leaving only the warmth of his touch, the quiet passion that had been simmering beneath the surface finally breaking free. His kiss deepened, and I felt myself give in, surrendering to the warmth, the tenderness that filled every touch, every movement. His hands moved down my arms, pulling me closer, and I felt the weight of everything we'd held back, everything we'd denied, melt away in the quiet intensity of the moment. When we finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling as we lingered in each other's arms, the silence filled with the quiet understanding that something between us had shifted, irrevocably. Are we doing the right thing?" he whispered, his voice tinged with a quiet uncertainty. I looked up at him, feeling the warmth, the depth of his gaze, and I knew that no matter the challenges ahead, this was something real, something worth holding on to. "Maybe there isn't a right or wrong here," I replied, my voice soft but filled with conviction. "Maybe it's just us." And as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that whatever happened next, this moment, this connection, was something we would carry with us, something that had changed us both in ways we hadn't expected but could never forget. The silence between us deepened, weighted with the knowledge that everything had changed. The familiarity of our office surroundings felt distant, almost surreal, as if we were standing in a world of our own creation, a space filled with possibility and risk. Nathaniel's hand rested on my back, his touch warm and grounding, and I felt the steady beat of his heart as he held me close. This closeness, this vulnerability, was something neither of us had allowed ourselves to feel before, and it brought with it a thrill and a quiet, steady fear. Our gazes met, and I could see the same blend of emotions reflected in his eyes, desire mixed with uncertainty, a longing tempered by the quiet realization of what lay ahead. He brushed a strand of hair away from my face, his fingers lingering at my cheek, a tender gesture that spoke volumes. The intensity in his gaze was almost overwhelming, as though he were seeing me for the first time, as though the connection we shared had opened a part of him he hadn't known existed. "I never meant for this to happen," he murmured, his voice soft, filled with a vulnerability that was both surprising and deeply moving. "I know," I whispered, my hand reaching up to rest against his chest. "Neither did I." The truth of it settled between us, a shared understanding that, despite our best intentions, something deeper had drawn us together, something that defied the boundaries we had so carefully maintained. I felt his hand tighten on my back, a silent acknowledgement of the risks we were taking, and yet, standing there in his arms, I knew that I didn't want to be anywhere else. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in each other's warmth, the quiet intimacy of the moment as powerful as any words we could have spoken. But eventually reality began to seep back in, the weight of our positions, our responsibilities, reminding us of the challenges that lay ahead. Nathaniel took a step back, his gaze still holding mine, but I could see the resolve hardening in his expression, the struggle to balance the emotions between us with the practicalities of the situation. "It won't be easy," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "There will be questions, consequences. I don't want you to have to go through that." I felt a pang at his words, understanding his concerns but unwilling to let fear dictate our choices. "We'll take it one step at a time," I replied, my voice steady. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." His eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude and admiration passing through his gaze. He reached out, his hand finding mine, and he gave a gentle squeeze, a silent affirmation of our shared commitment. For the rest of the evening we stayed in each other's company, talking quietly, sharing our fears, our hopes, exploring the depth of our connection with a raw honesty that felt both freeing and terrifying. There was a comfort in the openness, a reassurance that, despite the challenges ahead, we had found something real, something worth holding on to. The days that followed were a blend of normalcy and subtle shifts. We returned to our routines, our interactions professional and careful, but every once in a while our eyes would meet, and I'd feel a thrill, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that lingered beneath the surface. We found moments to talk, to share quiet glances, our connection deepening even as we maintained the boundaries necessary to protect ourselves and our careers. Each interaction felt charged, a reminder of the night we had shared, of the bond that had grown between us in those quiet, stolen moments. There were times when I felt the weight of the secrecy, the strain of maintaining a facade, while my heart yearned for something deeper, something more open. And yet the thrill of what we shared, the quiet intimacy that had bloomed in those late hours, was enough to sustain me, to give me strength. But as the weeks passed, the tension grew, the longing for something more palpable with each passing day. We found ourselves lingering in the office after hours, drawn together by the quiet need for connection, for the comfort of each other's presence. The unspoken understanding between the U.S. grew, a bond that felt as enduring as it was forbidden. One evening, as I was finishing up a project, I felt a familiar presence behind me. I looked up, my heart leaping at the sight of Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his gaze soft, filled with that quiet intensity that always left me breathless. "Late night again?" he asked, his voice gentle, laced with a warmth that made my heart race. I smiled, setting down my pen as I turned to face him. "Seems to be a habit of ours." He chuckled softly, stepping into the room, his presence filling the space with a warmth that made everything else fade away. "It's starting to feel like our own little world here," he murmured, his gaze holding mine, a quiet intensity in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. I felt the pull between us, the same magnetic force that had drawn us together so many times before, and I stood, closing the distance between us, my heart pounding as I reached for his hand. "I don't want to keep pretending," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Not anymore." He reached out, his hand finding mine, and I felt a surge of warmth as his fingers tightened around mine, a silent confirmation of the unspoken promises that had lingered between us. His gaze softened, his expression filled with a quiet resolve, and I felt a thrill of anticipation, a sense of certainty that, no matter what happened next, this moment was ours. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with a quiet urgency, a culmination of everything we had felt, everything we had held back. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I felt myself give in, surrendering to the warmth, the depth of the connection that had grown between us. The kiss deepened, filled with the quiet passion that had simmered beneath the surface for so long, and I felt a thrill, a sense of belonging that filled every part of me. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though he were afraid to break the spell, and I felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet joy that we had found each other in the midst of our complicated lives. When we finally broke apart, he held me close, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the quiet space between us. The room was filled with a warmth, a sense of peace that felt like the culmination of everything we had been searching for, everything we hadn't allowed ourselves to feel. For a long moment, we simply stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence filled with the quiet knowledge that we had found something real, something enduring. I felt his hand slide up to cup my face, his gaze soft, filled with a depth of emotion that took my breath away. "And it's not something I ever expected," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "but I don't want to lose it." I nodded, my own voice barely a whisper. "Neither do I." And as we stood there, holding each other close, I knew that whatever happened next, this moment would be a part of us, a quiet, enduring promise that would carry us through the challenges ahead. In the days that followed, we navigated the quiet complexity of our new connection, finding moments to share, to connect, even as we maintained the boundaries that kept our relationship private. It wasn't easy, but the depth of what we had found, the quiet strength of our bond, gave us the courage to face the uncertainty together. And though there were challenges, moments of doubt and fear, we held on to the memory of that night, the quiet promise we had made, a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with risks, but as I looked into Nathaniel's eyes, I knew that no matter the outcome, we had found something real, something worth holding on to. And as we walked forward, side by side, I felt a quiet peace settle within me, a knowledge that, in the end, love real, enduring love was worth every challenge, every risk.